A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy by Karl Marx. In 1859, Karl Marx published a small but powerful book that would become the hidden foundation of one of the most influential works in history, Das Kapital. This earlier text, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, was not written for fame or applause. It was written out of necessity. Marx believed that to understand modern society, its conflicts, its wealth, its poverty, its struggles, one first had to understand the structure of its economy. Only then could the deeper mechanics of politics, culture, and ideology be revealed. This book, therefore, was Marx's first careful attempt to map the world beneath the world, the economic base that shapes everything above it. But there is something suspenseful, even dramatic, about the story behind this work. Marx was living in hardship, writing late into the night in London's British Museum reading room, surrounded by stacks of economic reports, dusty ledgers, and government records. He was preparing what he called the first draft of a much larger project, a project that would later explode into Das Kapital. Yet in this early stage, we see Marx the investigator, Marx the experimenter, Marx the architect testing the beams of a new intellectual building. This book introduces ideas that would later become central to his theory, the concept of the economic base and the social superstructure, the nature of labor and value, and the early outlines of capital's internal contradictions. While smaller in size, it carries the weight of a blueprint that would shape political thought, economics, and social theory for generations. The following chapters summarize and explain this important work in an accessible yet intellectually serious way. Whether you are encountering Marx for the first time or revisiting him with experience, this introduction will guide you through the birth of ideas that still echo through today's world. Chapter 1: The World Marx Entered, Crisis, Capital, and the Search for Foundations. When Karl Marx began writing A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy in the 1850s, he did not step into a quiet or stable world. He stepped into a world on fire. Europe had just witnessed waves of revolutions in 1848, revolutions that surged with the promise of social transformation but collapsed just as quickly under the weight of repression and disorganization. The continent was buzzing with political disappointment, economic volatility, and profound questions about the direction society was heading. Factories were multiplying, machines were replacing skilled labor, cities were swelling with workers who often lived in cramped, unhealthy conditions, and wealth seemed to rise for some while disappearing for many others. For Marx, this was not simply a time of historical turbulence, it was a living laboratory. He believed that to understand the failures and frustrations of 19th-century Europe, one had to look beneath the surface. Beneath the political speeches. Beneath the rising factories. Beneath the chaos of the marketplace. There, he said, lay the economic engine that determined the rhythm of social life. Chapter 1 is about that world, the world Marx entered, the intellectual challenges he confronted, and the frameworks he began building to explain why societies move the way they do. This chapter sets the stage, the economic conditions, the philosophical debates, and the questions that haunted Marx as he prepared the groundwork for what would eventually become his monumental theory of political economy. The economic storm brewing in the 19th century. Imagine Europe in the mid-1800s. Steam engines hissed. Trains cut through mountains. Looms operated day and night. Coal dust floated through entire cities like a dull gray fog. Machines were not merely tools, they were symbols of a new age, an age that promised efficiency, prosperity, and progress. but for millions of workers, the promise felt hollow. Behind the doors of factories lay 14-hour workdays, low wages, child labor, unsafe equipment, and bleak living conditions. While industrialists gained unprecedented wealth, the laboring class struggled to secure even basic dignity. For Marx, this inequality was not accidental. It was structural. It was woven into the fabric of capitalism itself. But he did not come to this conclusion lightly. Before jumping to critique, Marx wanted to understand the mechanics. How does value actually form? Why does profit exist? What determines the structure of markets? Why do crises happen again and again? Throughout the 1830s and 1840s, Europe experienced frequent economic crises, periods when factories shut down, unemployment soared, and people were left hungry and desperate. These crises seemed to strike regularly, almost rhythmically, like the beating of a heart. Marx found this curious. Surely, if capitalism was as efficient and rational as its defenders claimed, such chaotic cycles would not occur so frequently. This was the environment into which Marx stepped, a world where people wanted answers, not slogans. A world where politicians, economists, philosophers, and everyday workers all sensed something was fundamentally unstable about the economic system but lacked the concepts to describe it clearly. Why Marx needed a critique before creating a theory. One of the most important choices Marx made during this period was methodological. Instead of immediately presenting his own ideas, he decided to begin with a critique, a detailed examination of the economic theories that existed before him. Why critique first? Because to build a new structure, one must know exactly what the foundation stands on. Economists of that era such as Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Thomas Malthus, and J.B. Say had shaped how Europe understood markets, labor, and value. They believed markets were largely self-correcting. They believed supply created its own demand. They believed individuals acting in self-interest would produce collective benefit. Marx respected their intellectual work, especially Ricardo's clarity, but he also felt their theories were incomplete and, at times, deeply misleading. For instance, classical economists argued that labor creates value, yet they failed to define exactly what labor meant or how it functions inside capitalism. They acknowledged profit, yet they did not fully explain where profit comes from. They recognized economic crises, yet they insisted the system naturally stabilizes itself. They described markets as neutral spaces, yet they ignored that power, ownership, and class shape every exchange within those markets. Marx saw these gaps and believed they were not minor errors, they were cracks in the intellectual foundation of capitalist economics. If one tried to build a new theory on those cracks, the whole structure would collapse. Therefore, his 1859 work was deliberately titled A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, not a finished theory. He was clearing the ground, preparing the soil, testing the beams. Before building, he was dismantling. The philosophical tension, material reality versus ideal explanations. Another major challenge Marx faced was philosophical, not economic. The intellectual world of Europe was dominated by idealist thinkers, most famously Hegel. These philosophers believed that ideas, concepts, or spirit were the primary forces shaping human history. According to idealism, society changes when thinking changes, when people adopt new beliefs, new morals, or new spiritual understandings. Marx respected Hegel's brilliance but believed the idealists had the equation upside down. Ideas, he argued, do not drive society. Material life drives society. The way humans produce food, clothing, housing, tools, and goods determines everything else: politics, religion, culture, morality, even philosophy itself. This was the seed of what would later become his concept of base and superstructure. But in 1859, Marx was not yet ready to fully articulate it. He was still gathering evidence, still refining the logic, still looking for the economic patterns that would support his philosophical claim that material production is the engine of history. This philosophical shift was revolutionary. It was like turning a camera around. Instead of looking at the world through the lens of ideas, Marx looked at the world through the lens of economic relations. Doing so revealed structures and contradictions that idealist thinkers had missed entirely. The British Museum, Marx's intellectual battlefield. To develop his critique, Marx needed data, sources, and historical evidence. He found them in one of the most unlikely places, the reading room of the British Museum. The room was circular, with high ceilings and endless shelves filled with books and documents: statistics, government reports, trade records, factory inspections, economic analyses, and histories of markets from ancient times to the present. Marx visited almost daily. He would sit for hours, sometimes from morning until closing time, writing in his notebooks, copying numbers, analyzing trends, and breaking down how markets functioned. He approached economics not as a theorist imagining an ideal world, but as a detective collecting clues. He studied grain prices from the Middle Ages, textile production numbers from Manchester, shipping data from London, and wage reports from industrial towns. All of this research served one purpose: to understand the hidden laws that govern how societies produce and distribute wealth. This meticulous process is what gives the 1859 book its unique flavor. It is less dramatic than the Communist Manifesto, less massive than Das Kapital, but more forensic, like an X-ray of the economic system. The importance of historical materialism in this early stage. In this early period, Marx was still shaping what would become historical materialism, the idea that societies evolved through stages based on their economic structures. He believed that hunting societies organized differently from agricultural societies. Feudal societies organized differently from capitalist ones. And capitalist societies will eventually be replaced by new forms of economic organization. This progression is not random, he argued, nor is it driven by moral choices. It follows the development of productive forces, tools, technologies, and methods of labor. When new technologies emerge, they often conflict with old social structures. This conflict creates tension, and that tension pushes society into a new stage. But again, in 1859 Marx was not fully ready to lay out this theory. What he needed first was a clear explanation of how the capitalist stage works, how value forms, how capital grows, and how economic contradictions develop. Only then could he explain why capitalism, like all systems before it, contains the seeds of its own transformation. The questions Marx set out to answer. To understand the 1859 book, one must understand the precise questions Marx was trying to answer, questions that remain relevant even today. 1. What is value, and where does it come from? Marx believed value was not simply price, nor was it determined by supply and demand. Something deeper was at work. 2. Why does profit exist? For Marx, this was the central mystery of capitalism. If workers are paid wages equal to the value of their labor, how do capitalists make profit without cheating? 3. What exactly is capital? Is it simply money, machines, land? Or is it a social relation between people? 4. Why do economic crises happen repeatedly? Why does a system built on efficiency produce regular periods of waste, unemployment, and collapse? 5. What role does labor play in shaping society? Is labor merely a cost of production, or is it the true source of all economic value? 6. How does the economic base shape political and cultural life? Do governments reflect the will of the people or the structure of the economy? These questions became the backbone of Marx's research. They guided every chapter, every calculation, and every critique he wrote. Why a contribution to the critique is so important. Some people see the 1859 text as a minor work, a stepping stone on the way to Das Kapital. But this view underestimates its importance. In this book, Marx formalized the idea that the economic base shapes the superstructure. He introduced the concept of the mode of production. He laid out early insights into commodity fetishism, the idea that objects in the market appear to have powers independent of the labor that produced them. He critiqued economic theories that treated markets as natural instead of historical. He began to explain the logic behind capitalist development. These ideas would later be polished, sharpened, expanded, and transformed into the core of Marxist theory. The suspense: Marx was building towards something bigger. One of the most exciting things about reading the 1859 work is sensing the suspense behind it. Marx knew this was not the final word. He knew he was only beginning. He knew that the patterns he was uncovering about value, labor, capital, and crisis would eventually become part of a much larger system. You can feel that energy in his writing, the sense of a grand theory forming just beneath the surface. This chapter, therefore, captures the tension of a thinker on the edge of discovery. Marx was not simply critiquing old theories, he was assembling the framework for a new understanding of society. A new map of human history. A new explanation for the forces driving our world. And it is in this early stage, amid the noise of factory engines, the disappointment of failed revolutions, and the intellectual battles of his time, that Marx began constructing the foundation for what would become one of the most influential theories of the modern era. Chapter 2: The Architecture of Value, How Marx Rebuilt the Foundations of Economics. If Chapter 1 explored the world Marx entered, its tensions, contradictions, and intellectual climate, then Chapter 2 takes us into the workshop where Marx actually began constructing the internal architecture of his economic theory. It is here, in the pages of A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, that Marx starts laying out the fundamental building blocks that would eventually become the cornerstone of Das Kapital. These building blocks revolve around one central question: what gives a commodity its value? This question might seem simple at first. A commodity is something produced for exchange: food, shoes, paper, metal, tools, and so on. But beneath that simplicity lies an entire universe of relationships, assumptions, and hidden processes. Classical economists believed they understood value. Marx believed they did not. And so he set out to rewrite the rules entirely. This chapter explains Marx's early breakthroughs: the concepts of use value, exchange value, abstract labor, socially necessary labor time, and the beginnings of his theory of capital. We explore them one by one, not as cold academic formulas, but as living ideas that help us understand how modern societies function. And we do it in the same hybrid tone, part philosopher, part storyteller, part guide. Let us begin where Marx begins, with the commodity. The commodity, the atom of economic life. Marx approached economics with the mindset of a scientist. If economic systems are like physical worlds, then commodities are their atoms, the smallest units through which everything else can be understood. But unlike atoms in physics, commodities are deeply social objects. They hold value not because of what they are, but because of what we do with them and how society organizes their production. Marx argued that every commodity has two sides. 1. Use value. 2. Exchange value. This duality is fundamental. You cannot understand capitalism without it. Use value, the material side. Use value is simple. It is about usefulness. A coat keeps you warm. Bread satisfies hunger. A table gives you a surface to work on. Use values exist in every society, capitalist or otherwise. They arise from the physical properties of a thing and the needs it satisfies. Use value is practical, concrete, and straightforward. Marx calls it the material bearers of wealth. No drama here. Exchange value, the mysterious side. Exchange value is different. When you trade something, say, a pair of shoes for a dozen apples, how do you know this is a fair exchange? Shoes are not apples. They cannot be compared directly. Yet somehow, in the marketplace, all things become comparable. A coat can be worth 10 yards of linen. A watch can be worth 30 loaves of bread. A phone can be worth a pair of shoes. What makes this comparison possible? That question haunted economists for over a century. Some said it was scarcity. Others insisted it was utility. But Marx saw something deeper. He argued that commodities can be compared because they share something in common: human labor. But not labor in the everyday sense, labor in its most abstract form. Concrete labor versus abstract labor. To understand value, Marx separated labor into two types. 1. Concrete labor, the specific activity workers perform. A tailor sewing cloth is different from a baker kneading dough. These labors produce different use values and cannot be directly compared. 2. Abstract labor, labor as pure expenditure of human energy. A tailor and a baker may do different things, but both expend muscles, nerves, time, and skill. When reduced to this basic human effort, labor becomes comparable. This was a radical and brilliant move. Marx argued that the value of a commodity does not come from its usefulness, nor from the whims of market supply and demand, but from the amount of socially necessary labor time required to produce it. Socially necessary labor time, Marx's core concept. This concept is the heartbeat of Marx's economic theory. It means a commodity's value depends on the amount of labor required to produce it. Under normal conditions of production, with average skill levels, tools, techniques, and productivity of that time. Not the slowest worker. Not the fastest. The socially typical one. This ensures value is objective, not subjective. Why socially necessary labor matters. If a tailor takes 20 hours to make a coat, but the average tailor only takes 10 hours, the coat does not magically gain double value. Society does not reward inefficiency. The value is determined by average, socially expected labor. This concept explains technological change. When machinery cuts production time in half, the socially necessary labor time decreases, and so does the commodity's value. This is why industries invest endlessly in better machines, cheaper production, rightward arrow, lower value, rightward arrow, competitive advantage, rightward arrow, more market share. It also explains why economic crises happen, why wages behave oddly, and why capitalism constantly revolutionizes its own processes. The pressure to reduce socially necessary labor time drives the entire system forward. Value versus price, a crucial distinction. Many people confuse the two, but Marx insists on their separation. Value, determined by socially necessary labor time. Stable in theory. Rooted in production. Price, influenced by supply, demand, competition, speculation. Unstable and fluctuating. Determined in the marketplace. Price is the surface. Value is the depth beneath the surface. Marx compares this to waves on the ocean. The waves rise and fall, price, but the water has a certain weight and density underneath, value. To understand capitalism, you must study the depths, not the waves. Why all of this matters, the beginning of Marx's theory of capital. All of Marx's analysis use value, exchange value, abstract labor, socially necessary labor time leads to one major insight. Value is created by labor, but owned by capital. This is the spark that ignites Marx's entire critique. The moment workers sell their labor power, something interesting happens. They receive wages equivalent to the value required to reproduce their ability to work, food, shelter, clothing. But the labor they perform during the working day often produces more value than their wages cost. This extra value is surplus value, and it becomes profit. Marx realized. Workers create value. Capitalists appropriate value. The gap between these two creates the engine of capitalism. But this realization required a strong foundation. Before he could talk about surplus value, exploitation, or capital accumulation, Marx needed to define value itself correctly. That is why the 1859 text focuses so heavily on these basic building blocks. From value to money, the transformation. As the book progresses, Marx begins exploring how value transforms into money, the universal equivalent. Money is not gold or paper. It is a social relation. It is a way of expressing value in a universal form. Marx explains that the evolution from simple exchanges, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, eventually produces a universal commodity, money, that stands apart from all others. Money acts as a measure of value, a medium of circulation, a store of wealth, a universal equivalent. This transformation is crucial because it reveals something profound. Value requires a form to express itself. That form is money. Money hides the labor behind value. This is where Marx edges toward one of his most famous ideas, commodity fetishism. But he only hints at it in the 1859 book. The full idea appears later in Das Kapital. The fetishism of commodities, the early seeds. Even in this early work, Marx notes that commodities take on a kind of mystical character in the market. They appear to have value on their own, independent of the labor that produced them. A coat seems to be worth 10 yards of linen, as if this is a natural truth, not a social one. This illusion hides the real relationships. Relationships between people, between workers, appear as relationships between things. This is part of what makes capitalism feel natural and eternal, even though it is historically specific. The internal contradictions begin to appear. As Marx dissects commodities, he notices contradictions forming. Use value versus exchange value. Concrete labor versus abstract labor. Labor as a cost versus labor as the source of value. Production guided by private decisions versus markets guided by social needs. These contradictions are not academic curiosities. They are the fuel that drives crises and instability. When production is governed by private profit but value is determined socially, chaos is inevitable. When companies race to reduce labor time through technology but rely on labor to create value, tension builds. When commodities must be sold to realize value, but workers cannot buy enough because their wages are limited, instability arises. All of this begins in the 1859 text. Marx does not fully solve these contradictions here, but he maps the terrain he will conquer later. Exchange as the mirror of society. Marx notes something fascinating: in capitalism, exchange is a social process, but it appears individualistic. People meet in markets as independent buyers and sellers. They seem equal. They seem free. They seem to be engaging in simple, voluntary exchange. But beneath this appearance lies the hidden structure of capitalist production. Some people own the means of production. Others own only their ability to work. The exchange between these two groups is unequal at its core. This inequality is invisible in the sphere of exchange. It becomes visible only when we go back to the hidden sphere of production where labor generates value that capital owns. This distinction between the surface world of exchange and the hidden world of production becomes essential in Marx's later work. It is how he explains why capitalism feels fair while functioning unfairly. Why this chapter matters: Marx was building a new lens. Everything Marx does in this early work serves a larger purpose: to reconstruct the lens through which economists view society. He wants the reader to understand. Value has a history. Labor is the source of value. Production is governed by social norms. Markets hide power relations. Money expresses value in mysterious ways. Commodities contain contradictions. Economic laws are not natural, they are historical. This is the intellectual revolution Marx is preparing. He is not simply criticizing past economists, he is building a new science. The bigger picture: capital as a social relation. Toward the end of the foundations laid in the 1859 text, Marx gives early hints about what capital truly is. Capital is not just money. Not just machines. Not just factories. Capital is a relationship between people mediated through things. A capitalist is not wealthy because he owns money, he is wealthy because he owns the conditions of labor. Workers must sell their labor power to survive. This dependence is what gives capital its power. This insight would later reshape the entire field of political economy. But here, in 1859, Marx is just beginning to put the pieces together. He is forming the philosophical architecture that will support his later analysis of surplus value, exploitation, and capital accumulation. Chapter 2 Summary: The System Beneath the System. By the end of this chapter, we can see what Marx was doing. He was building a science of value. A system for understanding how labor, commodities, exchange, and money interrelate. A framework for explaining the hidden structures of capitalist society. Where classical economics saw harmony, Marx saw contradiction. Where others saw natural laws, Marx saw historical structures. Where others saw individual freedom, Marx saw systemic inequality. This chapter, therefore, is not simply analysis. It is transformation. It turns the commodity into a key that unlocks the entire capitalist system. And now, with the foundations in place, Marx is ready to take the next step. Chapter 3: From Value to History, Base, Superstructure, and the Future Marx saw emerging. When Marx published a contribution to the critique of political economy in 1859, he was not merely analyzing commodities or dissecting labor time. He was preparing something much larger, a unifying theory of how societies develop, why they change, and what forces truly drive history. The seeds of this vision are scattered throughout the book. They appear not as fully formed arguments, but as flashes of insight, preliminary outlines, and intellectual breakthroughs waiting to be expanded in later writings. Chapter 3 explores these early breakthroughs. It explains how Marx connected economics to politics, culture, law, ideology, and the unfolding of history itself. It shows how the economic base influences the superstructure, how historical change follows patterns rather than random events, and how Marx believed capitalism was both the most dynamic and the most contradictory system ever created. It reveals how the ideas in the 1859 book shaped the development of Das Kapital, and why they still matter in the 21st century. To understand Marx's economic analysis without this chapter would be to understand only half the picture. Marx was not just an economist. He was a historian, a philosopher, a sociologist, a political theorist, and he fused all of these roles into a single framework. That framework emerges here. The base and the superstructure, Marx's most famous insight begins here. One of Marx's most quoted ideas comes from the preface of this 1859 book, not from Das Kapital. In a few pages, he outlines a thesis so powerful and simple that it continues to shape political theory today. The mode of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life processes in general. This sentence introduces the concept of the base and the superstructure. The economic base. The base consists of the forces of production, tools, machines, skills, technologies. The relations of production, who owns what, who works for whom, how labor is organized. Together, these form the foundation of every society. The superstructure. Built on top of this base is the superstructure, which includes politics, law, religion, morality, philosophy, culture, institutions, ideology. The base shapes the superstructure, and the superstructure stabilizes and supports the base. Without understanding this relationship, Marx argues, you cannot understand why societies function the way they do. This was more than theory. It was a method, a way of analyzing any society, past or present. Why this idea was revolutionary? Before Marx, philosophers believed ideas create history. Moral values shape society. Political constitutions determine economic life. Marx turned this upside down. He argued, material life shapes ideas. Economic relations determine political power. The structure of production organizes the structure of society. This is not to say ideas are unimportant. Marx respected philosophy deeply. But he insisted that ideas arise from the real conditions in which people live. People do not choose their beliefs freely, they inherit them from the world around them. This idea challenged centuries of philosophical thought. It suggested that if you want to change society, you cannot start with ideas alone, you must change the economic structure. That is why Marx begins with commodities, value, and production. He is not being narrow or technical. He is laying the groundwork for understanding human history itself. Modes of production, how societies evolve through economic stages. Another key concept begins here, the mode of production. Marx believed that all societies can be understood through their modes of production, the combination of productive forces, relations of production. These modes, he argued, evolve historically. They are not permanent. They are not natural. They change when they can no longer support the development of productive forces. To illustrate this, Marx outlines several historical stages. 1. Primitive communal societies. Small bands of people shared what they produced, with little class differentiation. 2. Slave societies. Agriculture expanded, and the ruling class owned both land and the people who worked it. 3. Feudal societies. Lords owned land, serfs worked it. Production was tied to tradition and obligation. 4. Capitalist societies. Private property, wage labor, markets, and capital became dominant. Marx believed that capitalism would eventually give way to a higher form of social organization, because every mode of production eventually produces contradictions it cannot resolve. The 1859 text does not fully describe later stages, but it establishes the framework. It shows that economic systems contain internal tensions that push societies into new historical forms. Forces and relations of production, the engine of change. Marx argued that historical change happens when the productive forces, technology, skills, tools, outgrow the relations of production, property, class structures, labor systems. For example, in feudalism, the rigid hierarchy of lords and serfs could not accommodate emerging trade, cities, and early markets. This created tension rightward arrow leading to revolutions and the rise of capitalism. In capitalism, vast technological innovation creates more goods with less labor, but workers still depend on wages, and capitalists depend on profit. This contradiction intensifies over time. The 1859 book introduces this mechanism. Marx saw history not as chaos, nor as moral progress, but as a process driven by material contradictions. He believed, when an economic system becomes a barrier to its own development, it is transformed. This insight positions economics not as a neutral science, but as the key to understanding social struggle. Class struggle, the social expression of economic contradictions. Although the 1859 text is more technical and less political than the Communist Manifesto, its entire analysis points toward class struggle as the central driver of history. Why? Because each mode of production divides society into classes with opposing interests. Masters and slaves. Lords and serfs. Capitalists and workers. The economic structure produces these classes. Their conflict drives social change. But here Marx adds nuance. Class struggle is not primarily about belief. It is about material interests. Workers want higher wages, shorter hours, and better conditions. Capitalists want lower wages, longer hours, and higher profit. Both positions are logical within their economic roles. This conflict is structural, not personal. Even if a capitalist is kind and a worker is grateful, the underlying relationship remains unequal. One must maximize profit, the other must sell labor power. Marx believed this structural opposition would deepen as capitalism matured. Why capitalism is both productive and destructive. One of Marx's most fascinating insights, which begins forming in the 1859 work, is that capitalism is the most dynamic system ever created. It revolutionizes technology. It expands production. It accelerates scientific progress. It reshapes social life. It creates global connections. Unlike feudalism, which stagnated, capitalism thrives on constant transformation. But this dynamism comes with contradictions. One, capitalism increases productivity while decreasing the value of labor. Machines reduce the labor time needed for production. But less labor time means less value created. This limits profit, creating a long-term contradiction. 2. Capitalism depends on workers as consumers but pays them wages too low to consume adequately. This produces cycles of overproduction and crisis. 3. Capitalism encourages innovation but centralizes wealth. Competition leads to monopoly. Small businesses are pushed out by larger ones. Wealth accumulates in fewer hands. 4. Capitalism spreads globally but creates uneven development. Some regions become industrial hubs. Others become raw material suppliers. This creates global inequalities that persist to this day. The seeds of all these contradictions appear in the 1859 text. Crises are not accidents, they are built into the system. One of Marx's boldest arguments is that capitalist crises, depressions, recessions, financial collapses are not accidental or caused by poor decisions. They are structural. Why? Because capitalists must constantly compete by reducing labor time, increasing productivity, and expanding markets. But this reduces the value of commodities, reduces profit rates, creates overproduction, limits workers' ability to buy the goods produced. Marx believed that crises were the chaotic expressions of deep contradictions within the system. They would recur as long as capitalism existed. This insight, introduced in the 1859 book, would become a central pillar of Das Kapital, the mystical world of the market. Another major theme begins here, the idea that capitalism turns social relationships into relationships between things. Workers relate to one another indirectly through commodities. Value appears to arise from the objects themselves, not from human labor. Social relations are disguised as economic relations. Marx later calls this commodity fetishism, but the early hints are found in this book. He saw capitalism as a system that hides the source of value, disguises exploitation, makes the economy appear natural and eternal, turns human labor into an abstract force, treats people as things and things as people. This inversion shapes ideology, culture, and politics. It makes capitalism feel like the natural order of society even though it is historically produced. How the 1859 text prepares the way for Das Kapital. Everything discussed so far, value, money, labor, the base superstructure relation, modes of production, contradictions is the foundation of Marx's later masterpiece. In the 1859 text, Marx tests the concepts, refines definitions, clears away old theories, identifies contradictions, organizes historical patterns, sets the stage for deeper analysis. It is the blueprint. Das Kapital is the building. Readers who understand the 1859 book will grasp the logic of Das Kapital far more clearly, because they will know where its arguments come from. Why this early work still matters today. More than 160 years later, Marx's 1859 insights remain strikingly relevant. Consider. Global supply chains reveal the importance of socially necessary labor time. Technological automation shows the contradiction between labor and profit. Financial crises demonstrate that markets are not self-stabilizing. Inequality between owners and workers continues to shape politics. Cultural and political institutions still reflect economic interests. Whether or not one accepts Marx's conclusions, his method remains powerful. It encourages people to look beneath appearances, to ask deeper questions. Who benefits? Who controls production? What forces shape society? What contradictions drive change? This way of thinking is one of Marx's greatest contributions. Marx's broader vision, a science of society. The 1859 book is not a manifesto. It is not a call to revolution. It is a scientific investigation. Marx believed that if humanity wanted to build a better world, it needed a clear understanding of how the current one worked. And that meant analyzing the real foundations, the economic base, modes of production, labor processes, and contradictions. His goal was not merely to describe capitalism but to reveal its inner logic. To expose its strengths and weaknesses. To uncover the forces shaping history. This scientific approach is what makes Marx unique. He does not rely on moral arguments. He does not romanticize the past. He does not speculate abstractly. He grounds everything in material conditions. That is why his framework still influences sociology, economics, anthropology, political science, geography, and cultural studies. Conclusion: Marx saw the future by understanding the present. As we conclude this final chapter, we see the true importance of Marx's 1859 work. It is here, not in Das Kapital, that Marx reveals his most fundamental insight. To understand society, you must understand production. To understand history, you must understand value. To understand politics, you must understand the economy. The 1859 book is the root. Das Kapital is the tree. Marx built a framework that connects economics to politics, production to ideology, labor to value, technology to history, contradictions to social change. He believed capitalism was powerful, dynamic, and transformative, but also unstable, contradictory, and self-limiting. He believed humanity was not condemned to live under one system forever. He believed history had direction, shaped by material conditions and class struggle. The chapters you have heard summarize this early, crucial moment in Marx's intellectual development. The ideas formed here would echo across the world, inspiring movements, debates, revolutions, and academic fields. The 1859 text is not the conclusion of Marx's thought. It is the spark. From this spark, an entire universe of theory would unfold.